Welcome to Alan Skorsky Reports. I'm Alan Skorsky. Today is the 600th day that our people have been held hostage by Hamas terrorists in Gaza. Today was also announced that Mohammed Sinwar was eliminated. Earlier this week, we celebrated Yom Yerushalayim. A week ago, we witnessed the assassination of two Israeli embassy staffers in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago, in Israel, a pregnant mother on the way to the hospital to deliver her baby was murdered by a terrorist. And while the Trump administration continues to apply pressure to Columbia and Harvard University, France, Australia, and Canada apply pressure to Israel. And this is on the heels of Canadians electing an anti-Israel prime minister. Attacks on Jews have become more prevalent as the media and elected officials become more complicit, while European democracies have sold their own people out. So it should come as no surprise that they would sell Israel out. Today's guest is Rabbi Dr. Mark Goldfeder, the CEO of the National Jewish Advocacy Center and a law professor at Touro University. Rabbi Goldfeder has testified before congressional panels at the state and federal level about combating anti-Semitism and the remedies that need to be set forth. Rabbi Goldfeder's work focuses on law, religion, constitutional law, and international law. Rabbi Goldfeder, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, so your position and what you do in law covers a lot of territory. One, we spent the last several years defining what anti-Semitism is, because as you said before, and many others have said, if you don't know what it is, you can't combat it. I will say how ironic it is that when it comes to defining anti-black racism, anti-gay bigotry, anti-any other group, you never have to have a whole conversation about it. But when it comes to defining anti-Semitism, now we have to have a whole conversation and define, hit this point, hit that point. Is it anti-Semitism if I do this but not that? So I know that you're an expert in this field. So if you would tell us, where you've gone with the definition that you've been working with.
Sure. Let me take a step back and just talk about, in some ways, anti-Semitism is very similar to racism, sexism, homophobia, other forms of discrimination. In some ways, it is a little bit different because Jewish identity is so multifaceted, encompassing aspects of race, religion, culture, ethnicity, national origin, heritage, etc., that sometimes it's hard to really place it. And sometimes that gives anti-Semites enough leeway and creates enough ambiguity that they can exploit that, commit heinous acts of anti-Semitism with impunity and then say it wasn't anti-Semitism based on this or that characteristic. So there is a need to talk about the definition here, and I will describe to you why I believe the IR definition is the correct one. But, as to the problem that you were describing, what we're seeing a lot on campuses and off campuses too now, as it moves to hate crimes, unfortunately, in the streets, is that people are pretending they don't know the line between speech and conduct. And my response to that is forget the definition. If you know the line between racist speech and racist conduct and sexist speech and sexist conduct, but you don't know the line when it comes to anti-Jewish speech and anti-Jewish conduct, your problem is not with the line, your problem is with the anti-Semitism. So now, going back to the need for a definition, I'll frame it in terms of Title VI, because that's sort of illustrative of the process that's been happening in civil rights generally. In the United States, Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires recipients of federal fundings to ensure that their programs and activities are free from harassment, intimidation, and discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin. If you notice, religion's not on that list. Variety of reasons, because people were concerned about separation of church and state and carve-outs for religious schools, etc. But regardless of the reasons why, the Civil Rights Act doesn't give the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, OCR, jurisdiction to investigate anti-religious bias. So for a long time, until 2004 really, the OCR typically refused to investigate anti-Semitism complaints on the ground that Jews are not a religious group and not a race or a type of national origin, so they were not included in Title VI. And so for years, Jewish students had little to no protection from systemic anti-Semitism on campus. In September of 2004, in a Dear Colleague letter, the then Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education, Kenneth Marcus, issued a series of policy statements announcing that moving forward, the OCR would investigate anti-Semitism complaints to the extent that they implicated ethnic or ancestral bias. And again, the logic here is pretty simple. most of the hatred that we see, most of the hatred embodied in modern anti-Semitism really has nothing to do with specific religious practices, right? Nothing to do with you do or do not put on tefillin in the morning or light Shabbat candles. It's everything to do with a real or perceived connection to the state of Israel, i.e., a perceived ethnicity or ancestral bias. You do occasionally see religious discrimination, but it's much less common. So this became OCR policy. And now, in theory, Jews should be protected from anti-Semitism as long as it's not based on this or that particular religious practice, which it very rarely is. But again, there was an additional problem. Again, we mentioned before, because Jewish identity is so multifaceted, without a standard definition, that led to an equal protection problem that still lingers to this day, and it's a contributing factor in the high rates of anti-Semitic incidents that we're currently seeing. I'll give you an example of a real story that happened. I've written the model bill that's used in a number of states to adopt the IRA definition, and here's a real story. One time I was testifying about an anti-Semitism bill that I wrote. And one of the senators was very opposed. And I asked him, sir, if you attack a Chinese person because you think we have unfair trade policies, is that not ethnic discrimination? He said, yes. I said, okay, if you attack a Russian person because you think Putin should not have invaded Ukraine, is that not national origin discrimination? He said, of course. I said, okay, if you attack a Jewish person because you hate Israel, isn't that anti-Semitism? He said, no, that's just politics. So how do you fix a definitional problem with a definition? And so in order to correct this problem, the federal government recognized this problem. On December 11th, 2019, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, announced an executive order 13899 codifying that now longstanding policy that for the purposes of Title VI discrimination claims, Jewish students were protected against anti-Semitism. And it also clarified that when they're evaluating these claims, the department should consider as contextual rebuttable evidence the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. If you want, I'm happy to go into the definition a little bit.
Sure.
All right, well, let me take a step back. The IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is an intergovernmental organization that focuses on Holocaust-related issues. And in the early 2000s, already, when they saw that anti-Semitism was on the rise again, the experts at IRA decided that part of never again means early detection and addressing anti-Semitism. And they realized you cannot fight something you cannot define. So they set about developing a definition of anti-Semitism. They had experts working on it for years. They first published it in 2005. It was endorsed as a guide by the U.S. State Department as early as 2007, unofficially adopted in 2010. And in 2016, after it was formally adopted by a plenary of the then 31 countries in the IRA, including the United States, our State Department formally adopted it. Since then, it's been adopted by dozens of other countries, the whole EU, over 1,100 or 1,200 entities altogether, including the supermajority of states in this country. But again, relevant to this part of our discussion, in 2019, the Department of Education formally adopted it as part of the executive order. So what exactly does the definition do differently than other definitions? A couple of things. The first one has to do with the practical difficulty of defining anti-Semitism, and the second one relates to the legal standard of objectivity, which is required when you're assessing discriminatory intent. The term anti-Semitism is relatively modern. It was first popularized by the German journalist Wilhelm Marr in 1879, but the history of hating Jews goes back much further. We don't really have time to discuss the whole history of anti-Semitism, but it is worth noting that there are some patterns that consistently emerge, in particular when it comes to anti-Semitism's focus, the form, if not the content of its justifications, and the process by which it allows otherwise decent and rational human beings to do horrible things. And I'll start with an observation from the late, great Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who believed that in terms of its focus, anti-Semitism often looks at Jews as a collective. The idea being that while individual Jews might be tolerable, Jews as a separate collective identity should not be allowed to exist with the same rights as other groups. And that's why the majority of anti-Semitism in any given era tends to focus on the primary form of collective Jewish identity at that point in history. So throughout the Middle Ages, Jews are for the most part a religious community, and they're hated for their religion, even if the particular Jews being killed in the Crusades are not particularly religious. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when many Jews become secularized, the primary unifying collective identity of Jews is their ethnicity. So the hatred mutates to focus on race, even when the Jews being oppressed only have a trace amount of Jewish blood in them. Think about the Nazi Nuremberg laws. Today, when the primary collective embodiment of Jewish people on the world stage is the state of Israel, Jews around the world are hated and held accountable for their state, even if they are not Israeli. So while the focus can shift over time, in every generation, people who are using this kind of bigotry, they need to use some kind of refrain for polite society, right? They have to justify their hatred in a socially acceptable way. So they say, we don't hate Jews, we just can't stand X, and the X changes at all times. So, Rabbi Sachs actually notes also sometimes the justification maps directly onto the target. So in the Middle Ages, what was the highest source of authority was religion. So that maps right on to the reason why we hate Jews. In post-Enlightenment Europe, what was it? Science. That maps right into the quote-unquote race theories. And today it involves using or actually abusing the language of human rights, which is the highest form of justice, with selective claims of social justice that see Jews, only the Jewish state, as worthy of condemnation. And again, one of the rare unifying themes that emerge from the history of anti-Semitism is the attempt at dehumanization of the Jewish people, whether it's portraying Jews as malevolently superhuman, like in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or worthlessly subhuman, like in Nazi ideology. Anti-Semites throughout history have found that it is easier to despise and eventually to kill things they don't consider human. And Jews are also othered in more subtle ways. For example, in America, they've been considered non-white when whites were being privileged, and now that they've been told that they are privileged whites when they demand recognition of their struggles. So the practical problem from all of that in defining anti-Semitism is that it is a mutating virus, right? Jews are criticized for being whatever a society or a particular part of society hates at that particular moment. So at the exact same time, in the exact same country, you have people on the right calling them radicals, people on the left labeling them fundamentalists. They're simultaneously too liberal and too conservative, too rich and a drain on society, too strong, too weak, too influential, too parasitical. Anti-Semitism makes for some very strange bedfellows. And so a definition of anti-Semitism that can encompass all these possibilities and more needs to be able to cut through all the timely rationales that are given for this timeless hatred, because if you don't, anti-Semites will just find another rationale and use that one, and then another, and then another. If you want to actually protect people, practically, you need a definition that focuses not on the reasons why people hate, but rather on the actions taken by those expressing or harboring that hate. A praxeological, in legal terms, a conduct-based definition, if you will. And the definition that best serves this goal is the IRA definition. It's precisely because it gives 11 examples that focus on the manifestations of anti-Semitism, meaning what anti-Semites do, as opposed to why they do it. That's what makes IRA such a good definition. Now, again, the additional strength comes from the consensus of tens of thousands of people across every spectrum agreeing that this definition best represents their shared experience, their shared lived experience. But the way IRA does that, the reason people feel that way is because while anti-Semites around the world might give different reasons for those feelings tend to manifest themselves in similar repetitive patterns. So that's the first part about why IRA is important. The second reason why our definition is the correct one is because context is crucial here, as it is in all instances of alleged discrimination. If you're a lawyer, you ever tried a discrimination case, you know this, right? Anti-Semitism is no different than racism or sexism in that context matters, and no two cases are ever exactly the same. And the reason the specific examples are provided in the IRA definition, for example, the ones about Israel, are explicitly not because all forms of criticism of Israel are anti-Semitic. Definition actually takes pains to point that out twice, but because there are those who claim that no criticism can ever cross the line. When you're handling an anti-Semitism case, you need to look at the context. And so the key line in IRA, right before the examples, is the explicit caveat that all the examples given, including the ones about Israel, could, taking into account the overall context, be anti-Semitic. And I'll also add that in a standard discrimination case, you need things that are objectively discriminatory. You need an objective definition, and there is and never has been any other definition that has ever been as universally accepted. So if you're looking for an objective definition of what does and does not cross the line, that's the IRA definition. And so that's what we've been doing, is trying to pass that around the country.
Let me ask you a few questions about that. First of all, let's say the IRA definition covers everything. But to me, it's like having the most amazing website in the world. If no one goes there, it doesn't matter. And this brings me on to another point, because I remember watching you when you were testifying before Congress. I think it was maybe the Judiciary, and Dick Durbin. Okay, he's at you were on a panel with Maya Berry. And here's like one thing, he was trying to deflect where He asked you, Rabbi, do you believe that language being used by politicians that humanizes certain groups adds to this atmosphere of hate? So and this is so typical, and I don't want to make this Republican Democrat, but it kind of is almost. The Democrats will twist everything to avoid acknowledging anti-Semitism. That's why they couldn't condemn anti-Semitism unless it included Islamophobia. And here you were on a panel, and Dick Durbin is saying, well, should we just focus on anti-Semitism, or should we make a whole category about hate, and then we'll let anti-Semitism slide into there? And I'm watching it, and I'm watching you, and you are certainly a foremost expert on this. And it's almost as if, to me, Dick Durbin and his colleagues they're mocking the Jews. Like they're saying, like, we'll take this seriously, but you need to chill because it's not any more serious than anything else that's out there. And what you're calling anti-Semitism, it's because Trump dehumanizes immigrants, so that contributes to hatred of groups, and somehow, the Jews fall into the cracks of that. So it's not that we're ignoring anti-Semitism; it's being elevated somewhere else, and we're going to try and make it as one big, hate challenge.
Yeah, well, I will tell you that hearing was in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as you mentioned, some of the Democratic senators did not want to focus particularly on anti-Semitism.
Right.
I don't want to ever make anti-Semitism a wedge issue. Unfortunately, I think Israel has become sort of a left-right thing, and it is dangerous for Israel. And I think that it would be horrible and dangerous for the Jewish community to make this right or left. So I would just say, in general, people who don't want to focus on anti-Semitism right now are ignoring a couple of, well, I'll say three very crucial points about why there's a need to focus on anti-Semitism right now. The first one is because there is an acute problem happening right now before our very eyes. The majority of religiously motivated hate crimes are committed against Jewish people, and it's not even close, and the numbers are getting worse. So this is not a matter of, well, we have to make sure everyone gets. We need to deal with this reality now before more people got hurt. Jews are literally being shot in the streets of DC. Number two, this is not and never has been about Jewish exceptionalism. This is about Jewish equality. As we described in length, there's an equal protection problem here, and some of it is definitional, and so it can be fixed and it should be fixed. And to the extent that it is not only about the Jews, if there are other communities that also feel that they're being targeted in this particular way and they have a definitional answer, their needs can and should be addressed in the same way. But third, and perhaps most important, it is necessary right now to address anti-Semitism, even in the context of a broader hate crimes conversation, because what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews, right? It didn't take long this time for the chance on and off campus to morph from death to Israel to death to America, and from spray painting hill houses and desecrating menorahs to disrupting pride marches and defacing George Washington statues and vandalizing the Freedom Bell. Stopping anti-Semitism is a matter of self-preservation for all Americans, because even if you aren't Jewish, they're coming for you next, right? Just ask them, they aren't shy.
So, like you said, death to Israel, death to America, and that was in Dearborn, Michigan. Where I used to live 20 minutes away from. That's where it started. Now, you've got imams all across this country. Texas, California, Detroit, Chicago, they're spewing hatred and violence against Jews. But it's never touched upon. When those tiki knuckleheads, going back to Charlottesville, they chanted, Jews will not replace us. Somehow, the left didn't have any problem identifying that as anti-Semitism. But when you've got imams, see, it's that almost like they're trying to protect Islamists and Palestinians-inspired anti-Semitism from being called anti-Semitism. Nick Fuentes, they'll say, is anti-Semitic. The Tiki guys, they're anti-Semitic. But the people calling for globalizing the Intifada, which to me, that call is no different than if you were on a college campus and white supremacists walked around dangling a noose just to taunt black students. It's no different. But I guarantee you they wouldn't think twice about whether that's racism and a threat of violence.
Yeah, well, again, the problem here is, well, it's not a problem, but the definitional issue here is that free speech includes hate speech. You're allowed to say whatever you want, however abhorrent, about Jews or the Jewish state, and that's protected. But there are limits to what constitutes speech, and there are rules from when it crosses over into unlawful action and individuous discrimination. And what we're seeing here are people who are unwilling to look at the actual facts on the ground. I'll give you a good example, right? It was in the news a lot, and we were part of the news in this because we had actually sued him in federal court. But the recently detained Mahmoud Khalil from Columbia University, right? People loved on particularly one side to pretend that he was arrested for simply expressing a viewpoint or for being anti-Semitic. Not true at all, right? First of all, the First Amendment does not shield material support for terrorism, and that is really the central issue at hand. What we charged him with in our case, what we brought our civil case in the case of him and his co-conspirators. But again, he's not being held for his speech, which again is protected, albeit to a lesser degree for non-citizens. He was being held for his actions, which go so far beyond the threshold for deportation under longstanding U.S. law that it's impossible to actually defend them on the merits. And that's what they're doing. Instead of actually looking at the merits, just conflating all of these things with, quote, being critical of the US government or the Israeli government. Again, if you actually look at the facts on the ground, particularly that's a good case for an example, right? He led Columbia University Apartheid Divest, their primary pro-Hamas group on campus that was fronting for the suspended Students for Justice in Palestine. Among other things, right? Among other things, they have become the most effective propaganda arm for Palestinian terror. They received explicit thanks from a virtual guest speaker from PFLP, a Hamas-affiliated Palestinian terrorist organization. At the encampment that he arranged, right, they famously shouted, "We are all Hamas." They identified Jews on campus as Al-Qassam's next target. They distributed recruitment flyers with a message from Hamas and PFLP that explicitly stated it was part of a coordinated, intentional effort to uphold those principles, right? Beyond propaganda, they engage in threatening illegal conduct, not speech, in furtherance of resistance, right? They coordinated hostile takeovers that obstructed campus operations that foreseeably resulted in illegal activity, including trespass, assault, vandalism, robbery, destruction of property, arson, criminal possession of weapons, burglary, false imprisonment, intimidation. Dozens of his followers were arrested for committing crimes. His group publicly doubled down on the notion that Jews should be murdered, even if they use the code word Zionists. And so when you pretend that that is all about speech, you completely lose credibility. And unfortunately, again, that's what we're seeing in a lot of these instances. People are trying to have the discussion at a 5,000-foot level and refuse to look at what's actually happening on the ground.
So again, that's a great example, and this is something that's infuriated me for years. I've heard Ilhan Omar say this, I've heard others say it, and again, Durbin, you mean I can't criticize Bibi? I can't criticize Israel? This is not blood libeling the Jews, is not criticism. I don't like the way your hair looks. That's a critique, that's criticism. Falsely accusing you of war crimes to then set you up as a target, that's not criticism. So the problem is that we don't even have the same definition. We have definition for anti-Semitism. We don't have a definition for what criticizing means. And then something I was going to ask you about is, what is the definition of combating anti-Semitism? So we know that Trump has pulled out everything, all the stops. He's going to stop giving them money. They're going to try and threaten their accreditation. That's combating anti-Semitism. But nothing else that we're doing. We're calling them out, but so what? So we have the Jonathan Tobins, and we've got the Douglas Murrays and the Richard Kemps, and they're telling the truth. But that's not combating or stopping the Mehdi Hassans, the Cenk Uyghurs, or all these other people who are dehumanizing Jews in Israel. It's not criticism, it's blood libeling, it's dehumanizing, and we're not bringing that to the front. And I'll throw one more thing in there. There are many, many pro-PLO groups. One of them is Students for Justice in Palestine. What do we have? Stand With Us and Jew hatred. To me, the labels that we operate under are way too parv. You have to say, we're going to stop Palestinianist-inspired anti-Semitism and hatred of, again, you got to make it a more concise, name for a group, but they're going after our throats, and we're just protecting our throats instead of punching back against people who want to destroy America.
A lot of stuff there. I'll try to unpack some of it. First of all, when it comes to Trump, it is actually incredibly important to remember one thing. President Trump did not add a single new crime or class or exception or exemption. All his executive order says is we're going to enforce the laws as written, which is incredibly powerful because it could have been done all along,
Yeah.
It just takes a federal executive appetite to actually enforce the laws. So we have laws on the books that really could help if they're being used. And again, thank God they finally are. For the first time in history, universities actually losing money because of their rampant anti-Semitism, their unrepentant, rampant anti-Semitism. So that's one aspect. When it comes to some of the other things you were describing, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your outlook, free speech, I think, was incredibly important in a democracy. Free speech is protected, even anti-Semitic speech. So what we have to do is label it correctly as anti-Semitic. In terms of the ways that we fight anti-Semitism on the ground, you're right. At the end of the day, when you have two student groups on campus and one of them is singing Achenu and one is throwing Molotov cocktails, the university does a calculation, say, "Ooh, who should we anger? Let's just tell the Jews to please walk away because we don't want to get hurt either," right? So it doesn't work to our advantage. But then again, we also don't want to sink to that level. So that's why really our organization, the National Jewish Advocacy Center, NJAC, exists. We took a look around at the landscape. There's a lot of good organizations out there doing a lot of good legal lawfare. Most of it
Yeah.
is sort of in a more defensive posture, right? Title VI and Title VII, which we do some of, but there are others who do it just as well. What we do differently is our strategic impact litigation. So we're actually going on offense after the bad guys. We're taking out SJP and
Right.
we're going after CUAD, and we have sued the Associated Press for buying photographs from Hamas. We sued Binance, the largest cryptocurrency exchange, for sending remittances to foreign terrorist organizations. We sued the Palestine Chronicle for paying one of their operatives to hold hostages in his house. We use the FACE Act in a creative way, along with some of our partners, to protect synagogues that are being attacked, and that has spread to protecting Hillel houses and Chabad houses.
Right.
We have seen behavior modified because of the new approaches that we have taken. So we are trying to be a little bit more creative, more offensive, more strategic than we have been in the past.
Right. Well, also, one thing I want to throw at you just to get your thoughts on this because free Palestine, two words that has three lies. One, that there is a Palestine. Two, the word free would suggest that that there is an unfree Palestine. And the third lie is that somehow the Jews and or Israel are responsible for keeping this non-existent Palestine unfree. And those two words, in my opinion, also have to be more closely examined for the meaning and the context, because it's calling for something that doesn't exist, which then justifies violence against Jews.
Yeah, look, in general, we don't have time to go into history, but suffice it to say that their leaders never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Over 33 times deals have been offered that they have rejected. And you could say that any one, two, 10 of those deals weren't great for them. Some of them were amazing. Some of them were so incredible that other parts of the Arab world, during the Clinton peace parameters, for example, told them that if you don't accept this, it's not just a tragedy, it's a crime. At various points in time, they'd offered to give back up to 99% of the land that they rightfully seized and got back in 1967. But setting all of that aside, again, from an American law perspective, free Palestine is protected as long as it's just speech. But when it's done and then the person shoots people in the street, it's clear evidence of discriminatory intent and pure anti-Semitism. And so, again, context is crucial here, but sometimes the line is pretty clear.
So let me ask you one last question because you've been very generous with your time. Um, 3 years ago, I did a show. This was when there was a Palestinian or Muslim doctor, I think, in Cleveland, who had posted something on her social media page about when she becomes a doctor or gets out of residency, she's going to inject, poison into Jewish patients. And I said then, this is not a one-off. She may be the first person dumb enough to do this, but now it's everywhere. It's all throughout Congress, all throughout medicine, throughout the law profession, at every level. They're out there now, and they're not shying away. So how you been going to combat this? Speaking of combating, is the medical association, are they now going to have criteria? Will they take away your license for engaging in threatening Jewish patients? Will the bar association say, 'cause I remember many years ago when when you graduated law school and you took the bar, you also, I think, had to get letters uh, testifying to your
But
character. So it comes again, the word combating. Now, again, you have Canary Mission who outs all these people, but that's not going to stop it from happening. So I don't know, what you think, how we go from here. Do we accept the reality and see the writing on the wall that our time in America is limited? Are we combating it to buy us more time? What do you think?
Well, very interesting questions. And we didn't coordinate this before, but if you go back and look at that Cleveland case, you might find, I believe I was one of the attorneys who got her license revoked in that case in
Oh, good.
particular. That's something that has happened a number of times since October 7th. Um, People who are open about the fact that they're going to discriminate against their patients are horrendous and do not deserve to be practicing medicine. We are actually in the middle of launching a new initiative. We represent a number of doctors who have been defamed, others who have had their licenses affected because they're Jewish and because people are calling them, for example, genocidal simply for being Israeli. But also to go after some of the people who are expressing an openness to harm Jewish patients. So, to the extent that there are any doctors out there who need help, we are hopefully going to launch a hotline soon. But in the meantime, we are working hard on representing as many of them as we can. And in the end, part of what makes this country work is the free marketplace. And so, hopefully, people won't go to those hospitals or offices where those doctors are, and the administration, even if they don't want to do the right thing for moral reasons, will do the right thing for financial reasons.
Rabbi Dr. Mark Goldfeder, it has been an honor to have you. I'd seen you on TV, on Fox News, and now I can say, well, we get guests just like Fox News gets. But you're involved in a lot of things. I'm also guessing that you're involved with Shurat Hadin, is my guess, from
They
Israel.
do great, they do great work. Yeah, we're not
Yeah.
having any cases with them right now, but big fans.
Okay, so listen, I want to thank you again so much. Continue to hustle on everything you're doing. Your work is so, so important, and thank you for joining us today.